That's good.
Can you hear us now? She said just started.
Okay. We're good.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That is absolutely fine. Everybody needs to look at their own strengths and weaknesses, and not everybody is really good at that. It's really helpful if you have someone that you can look up and say, where do you think you need a little bit more backup on running a convention or a division? I have my good friend from Portland, John Lawrence, who is more than willing to tell me my weaknesses as I am to tell him his. But I think it would be useful if anyone here thinks about that. What is it that you could need to be building on for a convention?
Well, Patty, I think, brought up a point that I think is important, is that not everybody has a very good awareness of what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are. I mean, there is the tendency to overestimate competence in a lot of people in certain areas. And it does require some introspection and then talking to other people and hearing from them, from people you can trust, what you do well and what you need to work on. And we need to look at that as well.
And that's just something, I think Patty was speaking to the executive level. So you are chairing a convention. What are your own strengths and weaknesses first? And, you know, is there a way to shore some of those up? I think that's what we were talking about earlier. So if you're not good at being honest with yourself about where you have problems, then you're seriously going to have difficulty in choosing the right kinds of managers. And I have several people who happily tell me what my problems are. It's a nice thing about being a college professor. My students will dive right in if nobody else will. So get somebody who's honest with you and whose assessment you trust. I mean, you know, there's honesty and then there's honesty.
I think it's also true not just for chairing conventions, but running any large area, be it a department or a division. One of the weaknesses I saw with somebody else way far away from here was that they took on a managerial role, and if the email got to be too much, they would then hide and not answer their email for 3 days. And at one point, somebody pointed that out to them, and they were like, well, that doesn't make a difference, does it? Well, 10 months before a convention, it might not. 10 weeks before a convention, probably, yeah. And they were not really aware that was a problem until someone said something.
Well, and that again gets to just general management principles that we need to be looking at, whether it's at the executive level or at the middle or the working level. Is part of running an organization is making sure that that your expectations have been communicated to everyone and they understand them. And that's another thing that traditionally we haven't always done that well, is that people are put in positions, but we haven't really done an effective job of communicating and getting a common understanding of how they are supposed to behave with relation to the rest of the organization. That's something, I mean, I see that every day at work. Sometimes it's magnified, but you know, people have to know where they fit in and what's expected of them and understand that and be able to communicate with others.
So let's take a look at this on a macroscopic level, because I think that there are a number of big questions first. And we might as well use the WorldCon as an example, but any one-shot convention that you work with is going to be like that. It's as I think Dave McCarty said in the Con Suite earlier, every time we run a WorldCon, it's a startup. And you know, some of you I know have worked for startup companies, and the rest of you have a pretty good sense of, you know, how hard it is to start a venture like that, $1 million venture. It's going to last 2 years, and it has a sell-by date. And all of that sort of stuff. So first you have to decide, okay, we're going to try and do this. Then you have to pick who's your leader. And one of the questions is, does somebody decide to start a bid because they assume that they're going to be the leader? Or is it a group venture and then the leader gets picked? And then the question is, how do you pick those leaders? So I think there are like a couple levels that we look at before we even get to who's going to be the executive, right? And right now, World Cons are being started on a regular basis in places that don't have enough of a fan community in those places to run the convention because they're bigger. They call for more stuff now than they ever did before. And so there's less of a built-in corporate culture from a group that knows each other really well. I think technology has not necessarily helped, and it's made things more difficult in many ways. It has called for us to do certain kinds of development that we've never had to do before. I mean, you know, if it was the 1960s or early 70s and you were running a WorldCon, you usually had a pretty good core group and you could often do most of the work in-house. Take that forward 10 years and that was not the case anymore. And, you know, in the mid to 80s to the mid 90s, we didn't even have the communication technology that would make that really effective either. So those I see as some of the issues that you have to deal with before you can even get to staffing. And then you get to how do you pick a leader?
Well, yeah, technology has certainly made some things easier, but not everyone adapts to it, and not everyone knows how to use it effectively. And again, that's part of the culture that has to be built in. The expectations for how you're going to behave as part of this organization is to accept that these are the ways we're going to communicate, and you need to buy into that and be part of it.
Have you ever tried to talk everybody on a committee into reading the wiki so they know what decisions were made? And heard throughout the room.
Yeah.
The other thing that happens with the technology is that if I am at an Oricon meeting in person, I am generally a flippant human being. Okay, that's not going to change. And people can hear my tone of voice and they can see that I mean well and that I'm not meaning to put anyone down. Email is a lot harder. And you can offend people at the drop of a hat because they come from a different style. The weirdest thing that happened to me when chairing the WorldCon was that I would offend more people on the East Coast than I would in Great Britain. And I never figured that out.
They were more tired in Great Britain.
They paid less
Been up longer.
attention to me. But that whole technology thing is great, but it takes management. And again, that can come back to you because you set a tone for a department head list, a division head list, whatever. But the same thing can happen with online Skype meetings. Everybody talks over everybody else, and how you manage that technology is something we're still not great at.
And you have to make some decisions about that early on, especially as you get to WorldCons, because, you know, as Deb indicated, 50 years ago, we had WorldCons mostly in cities where they had a sufficient base to do a lot of the staffing. That's not the case in a lot of cities now. So you're going to have a much broader group that is going to be spread out around the world. And you've got to learn how to manage that and learn how to make it accessible to everyone in 6 or 8 or 12 different time zones.
Yep.
When you're recruiting and you're looking for people, I think one of the advantages in working on conventions is that you aren't going to be on site to do the pre-convention work. So I guess they don't have to live locally depending on what they're doing. I know there are probably a few positions where they pretty much do have to be local, but anyway, so you are able to recruit probably even from other countries if necessary.
Oh, we do.
Oh,
Yeah.
all the time.
And that, I guess that's one of the things I've
it-
always been kind of sad that WorldCon hasn't been able to go back to New York because they don't have the people there.
That's not the people in
Yeah.
New York, it's facilities.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
exactly.
It's too damn expensive.
Yeah.
We certainly are seeing people from many more places involved in World Cons, and the technology has facilitated that. But
Yeah.
it's not the be all and end all. There's still a lot of hard work
Yeah,
that goes
exactly.
into setting up, deciding what your structure is going to be, and how all those areas are going to relate.
And
And
interact.
that's the
yeah.
hard work.
Some of it
Yeah,
can-
that is.
Some things can be done remotely. Some things actually do require eyes on and feet on the ground. And so for those sorts of situations, we will often have what are called all staff meetings. I don't like that term because it somehow suggests that everybody has to be there, and we don't want that to be the case, because we know working on a world draining of your energy. We don't want it to drain your bank book that fast. But we had situations regularly where people would come into Boston for our all staff meetings, and so that they could see the facility, so that they could figure out what they were going to do. You really do need to be there. And the other thing that I think those meetings gave us, and always give us, is a sense of bonding, a great chance to build a corporate culture that's a little bit different. Because when you can sit down with somebody over lunch and have a laugh and suddenly discover that there's a problem and you all fix it right then, there's nothing that's going to bond you better. So don't assume that, there isn't any local group, but the local group is sometimes, we're only local all at once for a week at a time or 5 days or whatever.
And the best thing that ever happened to me when I started being a division head, and this is like 50 million years ago, was working on the Orlando WorldCon, where we would go out and play miniature golf. I was shyer then than I am now. And that was a way for me to meet everybody across various divisions, and I loved it.
Yeah, there's no substitute for the face-to-face. We haven't gotten to technology yet that can handle that. And as Patty said, there's body language, there's tone, there's posture that are clues to people who are with you that somebody either by email or even Skype doesn't get. And we can solve things a whole lot quicker face-to-face, but we can't always do that. So we have to be aware of how we're communicating.
Sometimes we don't even know the problems are there until we get the chance to deal with each other face to face. My favorite example of that had we built our all staff meetings so they were like miniature conventions. So we had certain things that were going to be dealt with and various program items, and we all got together, and it worked very well. And one of those was about badges. And there's the nitpicking and fly specking committee that says that badges have to be, well, the names must be much larger than this, but badges have to be of a certain size now so that people can read them and all that sort of stuff. So we wanted to make sure that everything had been ordered that we needed to be ordered. I was in this meeting, and I said, okay, so where's we had the tape, because we were using these tape machines. I said, we have the tape, but where's the ink? We don't know. What do you mean the ink? And I said, well, if there's tape, there should be ink. I said, wait a minute. And I was still a smoker then. And I said, hold on. I got out my lighter and I took some of the tape and ran my lighter on it and went black because it was thermal. And we were planning on putting the names on those badges and then laminating them. Now, we would have figured out the error in like an hour, probably quicker. But it was so much better to be able to find that problem while we were actually able to go, okay, let's not do that. We'll pre-laminate all the badges and then we'll put the names on the outside.
So I have a question coming from the viewpoint of, I'm a staff member in a local science fiction convention. It's been here for 51 years. We have a staff. We're local. We have local venues and it's pretty much runs. But what can we do when a prominent staff person leaves? How do we fill that hole? How do we recruit people? How do we find people?
said.
We're going through that with the never-ending story for Oricon is that we have had exactly 3 successful hoteliers. One of them died, and
The job killed him?
no,
Just checking.
no, but we had 3 successful ones. One of them died, and the other 2 of us don't want to do it anymore. Please, 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 please. It can be hard. There are various ways to do it. If it's a large job, the thing I did for next year's Oricon right after the convention was write out how to break up the hotel job into 3 different jobs. The best thing is that our new co-chair was helping, and she is a high school teacher. Because of people dropping out, our volunteer coordinator for Oricon was a 17-year-old, and he did better than anyone had in the last 5 years. And we're looking for different places. I went through and researched every place we could list for volunteers. And we've ended up talking, we didn't get through all of them this year, but we found a couple of places that are art schools that we're trying to get people in to work on art shows. Linnea is going to go out and work on her high school students to be in on a couple of smaller jobs. And frankly, we'd be thrilled to death if we had a 17-year-old doing our social media, because we think they'd probably be better at it than most of the rest of us. But if you want to talk to me a little bit later, I'll tell you what kinds of things I found. But it's hard.
I mean, we've talked in the past about the need to make sure that jobs are sort of shared around, and that knowledge doesn't go away when one person does. And that's a tough. They're willing to continue to do it. There's often a tendency just to let them do it. Because frankly, we just don't all have the energy to keep, looking for new people all the time. That's hard.
I mean, in an ideal world, as if you're a manager running an organization, you should always have somebody who can step in. If you get hit by the proverbial bus, or, if I have to go out of the country for a year, somebody needs to be able to step in when I'm not there. That's basic organizational and management practice. We can't always do that. So we have to be always looking to recruit people who are interested and willing. And this, as you said, for long-term organizations, you get people who've been in a job for 20 years and are comfortable doing it, and all of a sudden they leave for whatever reason, and now you don't have any way of, you haven't institutionalized the knowledge, you don't have any mechanism to pass that on. That creates a real problem.
What we did for our registration at Bubonicon was I wrote a desk manual in case I get hit by a bus.
That's
Yeah.
always very useful. I
Exactly.
think putting it down in paper or in pixels so that somebody can reference it later is really useful, even if they ignore everything that we tell them.
This kind of feeds into, all of those feed into, a whole fork of things. Technology does not solve people problems. And many WorldCons have tried that and have not done very well. And often that's been, the driving force has been stated as, we want to make sure that everybody who needs the information has the information. And shared mailboxes, tried many things, and you'll find that many departments have already been sharing their information around, and they didn't need the additional layers which just got in the way. This also means that when the departments are playing nice with each other, they're already sharing their information, so that knowledge is built up. And the third point that was just from the last one was, I found it helpful I ran the Baycon art show for 10 or 12 years, and I found it helpful halfway on to just write myself a description of everything I need from one department and everything I give to other departments. And just even that, and publishing it out.
Absolutely.
And all of a
Yeah.
sudden, everybody else in the convention said, wow, we didn't know you did all these things. It's like, well, why don't you write up one of these?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we haven't done a job, we don't know necessarily what's involved in the job. And years ago, when I was a friend of mine and I were running program for our local convention, and it came to 3 days before the convention. We had the program all set. We were feeling pretty cocky. Oh, that hurts like hell. And we were feeling pretty cocky about the whole thing. And then somebody said, well, when are you going to do the pocket program? And I was like, excuse me, I'm going to swear now. What the actual fuck are you talking about? Doing the pocket program. And so they're like, yeah, that's part of the job. Nobody told me. And it shouldn't have been part of the job. There should have been a handoff to somebody who actually knew how to do it. So we had, I think, something like 48 hours. And I was teaching and I was tired. And so I set it all in 24-hour clock. And then I caught hell. And I'm like, look, you have a pocket program. Granted, it says, this is all in 24-hour time. But when you're putting the pocket program together at 3 o'clock in the morning, it is not apparent that 3 are 2 different times. So, cut it out. And if you don't share the information, and that was not on the list, the happy list of stuff, then people often just don't do it.
Yeah, that kind of segues into what I was going to say. 5 years ago, when I was young and naive, I thought, I can put together a list of job descriptions. How hard can it be? I'll just go online, talk to a few people, see what's written down already, to find that actually bugger all's written down already. Yeah. We need more job descriptions. I mean, I've been trying to put together some job descriptions, and as I've gone on, going to SMOFCons, going to WorldCon, going to that sort of thing, I found, oh, there's this job which I had no idea existed. Oh, there's another one. Basically, documentation is good. Put down what these things involve. I mean, it's going to be ever changing because of technology. This AussieCon had written some job descriptions which referenced MySpace very heavily. So, you just, obviously these things evolve, but, when you're starting from virtually nothing written down, there's got to, in all conventions, there's now got to be something written down. Put it online, label it, date it, say this is what this person did then, and make it a reference for somebody.
Yeah. And sometimes that's useful.
But I have found that fans are not always really great at writing things down, and I am as guilty of that as anybody. But the other point I want to make with that before you ask your question is that with WorldCons, you get some differences in how you set up your organizational charts and how you go through and divide up the jobs depending things to do with how your facilities are. My favorite example of this is that for the facilities for the Denver WorldCon, we ended up with one person whose sole job it was to go measure the convention center because they had 3 sets of plans and not one of them matched when it came down to the small pieces of what size those actual rooms were. Melissa was my favorite person on earth because I had to have someone whose sole job it was to try and answer all of the questions about the convention center. I'd not had that happen before or since.
What an amazing thing that was. And I think, by the way, that a lot of this speaks to one of the big issues that we were going to deal with, and that is how you build the management structure for any kind of convention. Because that's going to differ from convention to convention, from need to need. We spent a chunk of time going, okay, how many divisions are you going to have? And even before you get to how many divisions are you going to have, you really want a sense of, is there going to be a single chairman?
Yes.
So there are a couple of approaches to running conventions, and one of them is the strong chairman model, and another is a co-chair model, and I don't know that co-chair models are necessarily thought through because somewhere along the line there's going to be potential disagreement, and why are you having co-chairs?
Well, part of it too is this, looking at how you're going to structure your organization. And do you build the organization around the people that you have? Or do you design a structure and see if you can find people that can work within that structure?
Or
Because
both.
they're very different results.
Yeah.
And that's where, again, the recruitment and what skills people bring and how you can have complementary skills in the same area, so that where someone might not be as strong, they may have a deputy that can back them up that has those skills.
And some of it is individual choice. I said in my introduction that I chaired 2 Oricons. I co-chaired one and I single chaired Oricon 25. And the truth was that apparently I'm a cowboy because I don't do as well with a co-chair. I did okay co-chairing it, but the lead time that it took for Sam and me to make decisions
Longer.
seemed to just complicate things more than anything else. And I just didn't see it working. So for WorldCon, I was looking at a strong chair model. But I know people who've made co-division heads, co-chairs, co-department heads work. I'm just not one of them.
Problem with co-chairs is at base, it's a decision between who's in charge and who's in charge. And I think that a lot of times people say, well, so-and-so is not very good at this, so we'll get a second chair. But I don't know that just a single downside is a useful reason for a co-chair. You have to get exactly the right pair of people for co-chairs, and they have to. And if they both have the same weaknesses, then that's useless because it's just going to take more time. And a lot of times you have people say, "Oh, well, it's going to cut down the work." It doubles the work. You have to now communicate stuff that you thought you'd ever have until the convention is over. Kiss that goodbye. So I'm not a fan of the co-chair model. Can you tell?
No.
Yeah.
And I suspect there are probably times when it is effective. I don't know that there are times when it is as effective as one person who's reasonably competent doing the job they can do.
I did have it work with a division for Texas. And part of the reason was that I had a major league health problem come up, so that poor Warren Buff, who'd been going to back me up, suddenly had to be the co-division head because I couldn't do it on my own. And that worked for us, but both of us were going, how can we get along so well when we're so different in age and from completely different parts of the country? But that was the only time it worked.
Yeah.
However, that was on a convention where a co-chair didn't work because there were arguments and kind of favoring the divisions that belong to one co-chair versus the divisions that belong to another, which no one had ever seen coming.
Yeah.
I'm nicer than she is. It's the only time it will ever happen, so enjoy it.
She just wants you to think she's nicer than I am.
If I can, I'm loving your stories and I'm loving the depth of experience that we have here. I come to the SMOFCon specifically because of the depth of experience and wisdom in the community. I've benefited from that in ways that are incredible. My question is there a way that we can gather this organizational wisdom, as we call it in project management, organization, process assets, the experience that you all have, and have it available on a wider, sort of like a think tank that we can tap into it. I know technology can be a boon or a bugger, okay? Yeah. But is there a way that, I know there are hundreds of people that SMOF that couldn't come. I'm thinking right now, I wish I could transcribe this talk and write up some of these notes and have it somewhere that there's, just a cloud storage of thoughts and ideas on, Yeah,
I-
well, you've got this recording,
Yeah,
but other thoughts of what's worked and what's not worked.
there's a thing called the Con Runner's Guide that somebody started
Okay.
a while ago. So here's the
Mhm.
problem with doing something like that.
Mm.
You only get one set of instructions.
Mhm.
And if somebody takes it as an instruction manual, it's not useful, right?
Yeah.
If it's
Mhm.
just people talking about, well, this is what I did, and you can take something
Yeah.
out of that. That's more useful.
Well, I figured it's a here are the tips of what has worked and not worked.
Yeah.
More of storytelling of our experiences. You're sitting around a campfire and sharing it. Because one thing any SMOF knows, nothing works twice the same way.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Ever, and it shouldn't. So just wanting to say thank you for the wisdom and experience. I know there are people here we could talk to for 6 hours and not run out of learning.
Oh, most of them are in the audience.
The question is how to best leverage the available time and resources. And I love seeing this recorded because, my God, it is a blessing. And I wish I could just telepathically download everybody into a database.
Well, we can be bought. I'm just saying.
I
if you
know.
wanna
Well,
hire us-
as someone who has been bought as well, I totally get it. But just wanted to say, if
Not only
that's,
can we be bought, but we're usually pretty
cheap.
cheap.
well, I was about to say, I think a beer
I'm
or a
not-
glass of wine is usually it. Someone's got a question. Yeah, choosing. She says choosing vice chairs. What
Chasing-
models are there, and what
chasing
does and
is
doesn't?
funnier.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, wine or beer, we will buy you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it depends on what you mean by a vice chair. No. The question is, people put labels on things. So the question is, what do you actually mean? So a co-chair we think of as two parents in the room. And of course, the problem with two parents in the room is, thanks very much. If you, we got that. So if you have two chairs, there's a tendency sometimes for somebody to say, well, mommy said no, so I'll go ask daddy. And play the two against each other and all that sort of stuff. But they're thought of as co-equal. So if you're a chair with vice chairs, what does that mean you're doing? Are you designating them as you? And so they get to make their own kinds of decisions. Or are they like the staff? And I had staff. And my staff were people who could speak with my voice, but that was because they knew what I was going to say. And they didn't actually make operational decisions that cost a lot of money without talking to me. And they worked on specific projects and that sort of stuff. So I think it depends on what do you mean by vice chairs and why are you hiring them in the first place?
Yeah, again, that gets back to the organizational structures. If you're going to have these positions, what do you expect the people in them to do? What's their role? I mean, in some cases, they're very substantive. Other times, they're more like staff.
And I went the same model Deb did, that I didn't have a co-chair or a vice chair, but I had 3 exceptionally strong and I was happy with that. But I also think that I might have had a vice chair at some point, but it wasn't a model that we were used to using for Oricons. And in the end, what it comes down to is most of my experience is working with Oricons, so I didn't know how to use it. So I think what you say of having to be very clear on what you mean by a vice chair makes sense.
Or staff, it's like Mark Olson, who's sitting back there, was one of my staff people. And at one point he said, what do you want me to do? And I said, I don't know. I never had a staff before. So it was a mutual experience to try to figure out exactly how to effectively use a staff. I know military staff, they have a particular purpose and that sort of thing. But I was first not used to managing in that way, but then I also had no sense of exactly how I wanted people working with me to function. So that was part of the issue too. So good luck, Esther.
I've seen pretty much any organizational structure succeed. I've seen pretty much every organizational structure fail. What you need to be able to do is keep self-examining and saying, this structure isn't working, let's restructure. And restructuring is a tool that has to be part of your toolbox, particularly for WorldCons at the chair and division head level, where we have had a long tradition going back 40 years of WorldCon has had one or more failing division heads. You know, it just is going to happen. And you've got to be prepared to deal with how you structure things so that you can make the convention work when somebody as senior as a division head or a chair fails.
See, if I were to just say to anybody out here, they want to chair a WorldCon or a WesterCon or an Oricon or any other con, I would go up and say that the person that they want to talk to is Bobby Armbruster about timelines. Because one of the things that happens, and this was a weakness I had, is that without a timeline or clear measurements, if you're totally embroiled in one group, you can end up not noticing that a failure is coming around until it's too late. And that's the biggest problem that I ran into, is while we were madly dashing around here, something else was going down the tubes, and I didn't realize it soon enough.
So I think by timelines, you're talking about a set of deliverables.
Yes, that's
And,
a much better term.
And I think it's useful to think of them as deliverables, things that people are supposed to do at a particular time, because that way you can say, okay, I haven't heard back on X, Y, and Z. And you don't get so caught up in the timeliney nature of things, because sometimes those timelines can be just real. I mean, somebody said, oh, we need a timeline for the entire convention. I said, oh, just let me commit suicide right now. But if you have deliverables, Mark, who was it who said people don't do what you expect, they do what you inspect? Yeah, and I think that was that's something that Mark uses as a regular comment, and I think that that's certain. So if there's a thing that is now coming due, a deliverable, boy, but the problem, of course, is that early days in a convention, when you can make some quick decision that'll solve everything, you don't have enough deliverables. So figure out how you can put more of those into your system.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That and also to Ben's point, having worked in private industry for a long time, when you have good people, you can make almost any organizational structure work. Mm-hmm. If you don't have good people, they'll usually fail even in the most well thought out structure. Mm-hmm. So you've got to figure out the medium, what will work for the people that you've got or that you can get, figure out how they work effectively and put a structure in that takes advantage of that.
One of the things, and this is probably the most general thing I'll say today, is that if you have a limited pool of people you really trust and who are really competent, and we all do, if you have a vision for what you want out of your convention or your division or whatever, if you have a vision that you really want to see happen, you're going to have to put your strongest people in there to make sure it happens. And again, that's a very personal philosophy, but if I have things that I want to happen and I know that my attention is going to be spread over 50 or 100 different things, I'm going to look up and say, I want this person here because I know they will do my bidding.
Yeah. Okay. I like stopping at a do my bidding for a second. Yeah.
It's a dream.
So you've talked about the problems of dealing with co-chairs as a co-chair. How do you deal with co-chairs as? What is the best way to walk into the conversation with the co-chairs and go, hey, what do I need to know?
Oh, well, I mean, I was going to say, decide which one you like the best and shoot the other, but what are you trying to do, I guess? Is it you're trying to manage up? Is it
when I haven't worked heavily with them before and I'm trying to figure out what do I need to know about their personal management styles, what do I need to know that are their sore spots that I shouldn't go anywhere near? Just what do I need to know to figure out how this might be
Yeah, but
working?
that may not be direct. That may be the kind of thing you have to ask other people who work for them.
I've asked
Right.
for recommendations before.
Yeah.
I've used people, and again, and I will keep saying this, one of the things that I've asked about people is whether they answer their bloody email. Because I see that as being one of the big weaknesses in management structures. But because my memory is not always the best, I will cheerfully tell you that when I had all the division heads and assistant division heads, I used a trick I use when I'm teaching classes, and I had a spreadsheet where I had something I knew personally about each of them that I could relate back to. Someone said, "You're so warm and you always remember things about me," and I'm neither warm nor do I remember things. But find out and watch in the early stages of, if you start a discussion on email, say, if you start a discussion of, we need a policy of this and I want my management group to discuss it, start looking at who doesn't talk. Start looking at who talks too much. Start looking at the person who says, well, I don't care about that at all. You know, it doesn't have to do with my division, because that's going to hurt you in the end when you want to have a management team. But just watch people and see what you see.
To your question, which I think is also about being a manager working for an executive or a pair of executives, I sometimes think that we, especially those of us who work on conventions, and this is not our real job, and it's often not even close to our real job, is our management style even accessible to us? So somebody asked me, what's your management style? I said, well, I have a bullwhip. And you know, that's the, can I as a person who's been an executive say, well, I do this, this, and this. And I'm not sure that we can. So I think you ask those very factual questions of, how much do you want me to communicate with you in email? If you're overstressed, can I call you? What do you want me to do about X? You know, at what level should I make these kinds of decisions, or should I pass the decisions up to you? And I think that's going to be the same for regular, you know, for strong chair, for co-chairs. But then the other question you have to ask with co-chairs that you don't with a singleton chair is, who should get these kinds of questions? Or should I email chairs at, and you both see them and then you make decisions? How long should I wait for decisions? No.
Yeah, I think this is, you know, you may not be able to ask some of those questions directly, especially if you haven't worked with the people before and you don't have an existing relationship with them. If you do know them, then you may be able to say, how are we supposed to work together? How do you want this organizational structure? What do you expect of me? What do I expect of you as the chair or the co-chair? You know, how long do I need to wait before I say, okay, this has gone too long, I need an answer? What are the parameters of this relationship?
Well, and how do they like to communicate best? I will do email as often as I can, but at the point I was chairing, I was teaching classes all day, and texting me was the most useless thing on earth because I couldn't have my phone in my classes. But just knowing what people's preferences were meant I did not make them as angry by phone calling the person. The person I had as a division head who hated phone calls unless the building was burning down.
And by the way, just a sort of secondary note there, just because someone's not responding in one method of communication doesn't necessarily mean they're ignoring you. So I had a situation where somebody came to me and said, I've sent multiple emails to this person, they haven't replied. And I said, well, have you called them? No. Here's their phone number. And so there was a phone call made, and then they found out they'd been typoing the person's email address. And you know, that happens, it certainly has happened to me on multiple occasions where I'm like, why aren't you answering your email? Because I'm not getting email. But oh yeah, your last name isn't spelled that way, is it? So I've
Well,
done it too. We all have.
I had a situation at work a couple of weeks ago where I was seeing an email conversation between a couple of other people who were talking past each other. And I finally picked up the phone and called one of them. And I said, just call that other person on the phone because you're not communicating by email.
Yeah.
Just pick up the phone. I said, when you've got the third email, no questions are being answered, cut it off, pick up the phone and
Use
say,
something else.
okay, let's try another communications channel.
And one of the things, and this was for a WorldCon, if I was chairing an OraCon, I'd probably be doing this myself. One of my chairman's staff was Helen Montgomery, who was she is a social worker. I had been a social worker at one point. But a big piece of her job was to kind of check in with people if they were running into problems with performance.
Mhm.
And that worked pretty well, except this is when I ran into one of my own weaknesses, that I was more used to being the touchy-feely one than being the person in charge. And I realized I was jealous of Helen because she got to do the nice things of being the nice person. But it was a way to check in and see, we just want to see how you're doing with this job. And it ended up with her being able to help most people, but not everybody.
I like being bad cop. Did we answer your question? At least a little?
Some ideas.
I don't think there's any perfect answer to any of this, is there?
There's no perfect answers.
I think you just raised the issue that I would base my question on is a chairman has to be able to be bad cop as well as good cop. And how does the group choose a chair or choose their subordinates with and discuss the ability about being a bad cop?
I'm not sure we do.
Yeah.
If it's an annual convention, there's often each group has a different kind of process for picking a chair. And it's usually, okay, is there somebody willing to chair? And I know a convention right now that has no the next year. And I'm like, oh, that's going to be harsh. It's not a bid situation. Or are you doing a bidding kind of thing and somebody has started the bid and so they're the obvious person to potentially chair a convention. In Boston, when in 2001, when we were deciding whether or not to run, the WorldCon for 2004, one of our people, the late George Flynn, who was wonderful, did a poll, not an annual poll, but he did a poll and said, if we win the rights to host the WorldCon, who do you want as chair? Who would you like as treasurer? Who would you like as secretary? And when it's a decision-making process like that, people are not sitting down and saying, okay, I want Deb because she bakes good sweet rolls. They're just deciding that they think I can do the job. And so I don't know that we're as introspective at all about making the choice of, I'm picking so-and-so because they're going to be able to be bad cop and good cop, as much as this is somebody I've worked with and I trust, right? And so those executive decisions about who we're going to have really come down to, can the group cope with them? At least if it's done that way, right? So
There's one issue we haven't talked about at all that I want to make sure we do. And that is when we're going through and we're filling division heads or we're filling department heads or anything like that, essentially we're working with social groups that at least some, not all, will be going to the same place to have beer together for the next 20 years. And some of them are partners with each other. And that's one of the things that I've seen that's a completely different management structure from everything I've worked in. I've worked in nonprofits most of my career. And the nonprofits I worked in pretty much had the rule that people did not get to be married to each other and work in similar jobs. Here, sometimes the best choices you have involves putting both pieces of the couple together. And I think that's one of the things we need to think about is working with friends, working with partners. What happens if one half of it doesn't work out, or that when we're talking about division heads maybe fighting, if the division heads fighting are people who are married. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, that's a particular issue for us. It's not an issue in many other types of management. We're managing our friends. And a lot of times we're picking people because they're our friends and we trust them. And so when we manage our friends, there's the potential for an ongoing relationship. At least we hope so. And I knew at various points, well, in 2001, when we were going to be, our bid was going to be decided in Philadelphia, and I went, so if we lose, I have to leave fandom because I can't do this to my friends again. Friends don't let friends run World Cons. Friends help friends run World Cons. That's the thing they don't tell you. So being a convention chairman means you get to use your friends on multiple occasions in different kinds of places.
Now, I know that being the chair is probably the hardest job of running a Worldcon. I think the second hardest job is the programming division manager. What skills do you look for when you're trying to get it to fill that role?
Well, I know I wanted people who had worked together before and who had run large programs, because frankly, there are several places I wouldn't want people with no experience, but designing a program, being in charge of hotel or facilities, or being treasurer, a Worldcon is not where I would start.
No. I don't think any single job is more difficult than any other single job. But here's the thing to remember about managing and how we choose our managers. We're asking people who are managing divisions or departments or any of the big jobs to make a pretty strong commitment. And that's a commitment of time and energy and often money, their own cash that goes into doing all of that. So there has to be that willingness at the very beginning, as well as the skills. And then you start going through your people pretty quickly. Those are tough things to look for in people.
One other thing I would say that's a very general tip, and that is if you're working on conventions, make friends. Seriously, if you're ever running anything, you're going to ask somebody to do something that was much harder than you ever envisioned it was. And being nice to people and making friends and looking around at somebody and saying, this is my favorite story of all time. The reason I started working Worldcons is the first Oricon I was hotel liaison for. The great and mighty Bruce Pells, who was the leader of West Coast fandom, on that Sunday called me over in the bar and said, "Kid, I think you have potential." Seriously, it's exactly what he said. And nothing could have encouraged me more than that.
I think we make friends because we like to make friends and because we enjoy working with each other. My suggestion is not just to make friends, but also practice looking pathetic. Work on this in a mirror, possibly using a video camera. There is someone in this room, and I knew that the only way I could convince her to do a particularly massive job that she did better than any other human being has ever even thought about doing it was to look as pathetic as I could for as long before I actually asked the question.
I am really trying to figure out between Deb and me which one of us is more manipulative, and honestly,
I did tell her that I was practicing looking pathetic, so I'm not sure if it's manipulation if you tell somebody what you're doing, but
oh, that's manipulation. All right.
But I think it's always useful, if we're going to have to ask people to do hard jobs, that we've been willing to do the hard jobs as well.
And I think that's a good point. But one of the things we also have to keep in mind is that while we may have done that job 10 years ago, it may have changed since then. And if we're not aware of how the overall jobs and all the things that have to go into work, we may come in with a bad set of, or an unreasonable set of expectations or idea of how something should happen. So this again gets back to the self-awareness. What is your view? How much do you know about, how much of it have you acknowledged internally?
So this relates to a few of the threads so far.
Did you say threads or threads?
Threads.
Thank you. I'm having trouble hearing after the flights yesterday.
And that's how do you bring new people into your structure in terms of, so I think this relates to recruitment, and it's not just finding the 17-year-old at Oricon who stumbles into doing a good thing, but then also retaining said 17-year-old.
Well, they'll be 18 eventually. So
well, and integrating them into what are frequently our friend groups, the people we go have beers with, who and yet aren't large enough friend groups to do everything. So we need to bring new people in. And could you talk about maybe strategies for doing that either in how we structure our organizations to begin with, or how we bring people in once we've already set that up?
Well, there's still clubs, but it's a different kind of, it's not the same sort of club circuit that, it once was. And I think, one of the problems potentially is that you have a lot of people who've been working together for decades. And it's kind of tough for people to break into that. I don't know, how did you all get into convention running? So, what do you mean by stubbornness? Yeah, go back to the, we'll make you talk in the mic.
So I answered Deb's question for the people on the phone, Zoom, with stubbornness, and it mostly had to do with, we had a new baby, we desperately needed community, and I didn't go away despite the fact that for the first 3, close to 4 years at NorwestCon, it felt actively hostile.
Yeah.
And it's the same sort of strategy here, but with WorldCon, I feel on some level as well. But I don't think that relying on people to just be stubborn is necessarily the best strategy, because some of us will be, and then others will just, who could have been really useful parts of our community, will just bounce because why stay?
I think outreach is a great, huge thing. And the best example I actually have is Reno. And I didn't have hotels in Portland to do a WorldCon up there. And when I decided, like I said, I'm a cowboy, I wanted to chair a WorldCon. The thing about Reno was that they did not have fan groups that I was going to be stepping on their toes. However, as I did some work around and started talking to people down there, we located a Star Trek group. We located at least 2 writers groups at the college. We located a bookstore that decided we were the best thing that she ever heard of. Her name was Zoe, like my daughter's was, so she occasionally got my high school daughter's emails. But we did try and reach out. For Oricon, we've had the Mandalorian Navy doing more, because the Mandalorian Navy wants to do more of their programming. And now they tend to be running our green room.
These are the David Weber fans?
Yeah. We had David Weber as a guest of honor, so they decided we were okay. And now that part of that ship that's running our green room, it's the first time we've had a stable green room in 5 years. They've done it, this is, I think, their 3rd year in a row. But there are clubs and there are things out there, but you got to do the outreach. For one job, I did a hotel training that I put out on all of our lists that I was willing, if you wanted to come to my house, I would train you how to do the hotel job. And I got 8 people. one of whom wanted me to run their Mensa convention, 2 of them. And several wanted to work on our gaming convention, and no one wanted to do Oricon. But it got some new people into the group. But you got to go out there and look for people. And I went and talked to Star Trek fans, and I'm not a big Star Trek fan, but I can talk enough Trek, you know.
Do they stay? That depends. You know, sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get people who come and they work on a Worldcon because you have this big show in town, and then they go, oh, but there's no more big show, and they disappear after that.
Yeah.
And sometimes you get people who work on a big show and they say, well, that was a hell of a lot of fun. Now what can I do next? And I think it depends on the person. I think it depends on what experience they've had. But, you know, a lot of it's really going to be person specific. And, you know, are there social occasions that you have where people can interact with each other in a somewhat socialized environment, but many of us who are fans are just really lousy at social. So, and NESFA, the New England Science Fiction Association that I've been a member of in the past, has these things called other meetings. So they have formal meetings in their clubhouse once a month, and then on alternate weekends, off weekends, they have other meetings, and they're social occasions at somebody's house. They're designed to be more relaxing. Well, I don't know about you, but if I'm going to a strange person's house with other strange people that I've never met before, that's going to be much more awkward than some of the, you know, so I don't know that that was really thought through. But having a picnic where you get a whole bunch of people coming to the picnic and interacting, that's going to be useful. You want people to like each other.
And if you see someone doing good work, I can't emphasize this enough. I had someone in Texas who was given to me when I didn't have someone for special projects. And the first time I talked to Jessica, I said, yeah, I've got a job for you, but it's really peculiar. And I had her researching mechanical bulbs so that we could put Randy on a mechanical bulb. And I gave her like 5 instructions. And 2 days later, she had called 4 companies. She had laid it out carefully and told me which one had the best insurance and how to move it in and out. And I said, oh, girl, I want you to work for me forever on every convention I ever work on. But it helped because she hadn't had much luck being put together and put to work in another division.
Yeah.
So anytime you spot talent, anytime you spot it anywhere, tell people. There were 2 people in the Kansas City Worldcon that I made sure to say, I hope you turn up again because God, you're good.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you see people who are doing a good job, find out what they really want to be doing. If they want to be doing something different, if they're ready to handle more responsibility or want to do something different, pay attention to them. Pay attention to everybody. Be aware of what's going on.
Yeah. Start them small and then suck them in.
Yes.
Realizing that some people will be great and they're the kinds of people that you can promote up the ladder really fast, and other people won't. And one of the downsides, of course, of that is some people think they should be brought in at really high levels, and we don't know them, right? And that's the hard part for us as managers, because people say, well, you're only using your friends. Well, no, I'm using people whose work I know, and you're new, so I don't know you yet. And I don't know how to escape that problem. And if anybody else has a good idea, just let me know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in part, as was just mentioned, recommendation. You don't know necessarily who are good fans in Los Angeles. You know people who are good fans in Los Angeles, and you pick up the phone or email or whatever and call them and say, hi, who do you got who might be a good sucker? I mean, a volunteer.
Yeah.
And a place like this is a beehive of cross-pollination and recommendation. And it was designed to be when we first invented SMOFCon, because you get all these people from all over, initially all over the States and now all over the world. Everybody has a circle of people they know. And, you know, you tell somebody else, you know, this person is really, really good. I might not be using them now, but I know somebody who can do this thing. So there, go
Yeah,
find them.
and we do that, but I
Yeah.
think on a local level, it's a little more tough.
It's harder on a local level. It's harder. The more integrated a group is, the harder it is to break into that group. And
Pardon me?
Yeah.
World
I think that that's certainly true at certain levels. Yeah.
And I think the recruitment and getting people in, and you're so busy you don't stop to talk to new people. Because I've been a teacher and a social worker and worked in mental hospitals, you know, everything I do has been talking to people in my life. I really enjoyed when we were doing the outreach for Reno, or I talked to some people for Kansas City, of trying to make sure that I always said to people, come on in, do this, work on it. But it's hard to remember that.
And for those people who were asking the earlier question about how did you get recruited? I got recruited. I showed up for my third convention. I stepped out of the elevator. The person running the film program, who had met me at my second convention, and we chatted for a little bit, and it turned out we had a common interest. The elevator doors opened. She looked at me. She said, "Ben, great to see you. I live in a 6th floor walk-up, and I've got 35mm film that needs to be transported. Go into this cab with me, and we're going to carry a ton of film, literally a ton of film."
I personally don't get into cabs with people that I don't know, except cab drivers. So.
But
You know, go for it.
Yeah, but it's true. The story of how the very first Oricon, she said, dating herself, I had no intention of working on the convention. I was young. I was going to turn up and get drunk all weekend. And the person who was doing Reg didn't show up. And there was a line of 200 people, and I happened to know the person chairing it. And I said, I don't know much, but I don't think there should be a line of 200 people waiting here for an hour. And he was like, well, I don't know what to do and all of that. The reg boxes are upstairs. And I said, can I at least just pass out the badges? And he said, yeah, but I don't have anyone to carry the boxes. And I said, would you let me do it? And I found the largest SCA guy and said, hey, how would you like your badge first? And that was how I got involved with conventions. And if you look for people who turn around and volunteer, you know, we can kid about the 17-year-old that turns up. He's coming back in Treasury next year. Yeah. We got to. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it depends on the group. And I think it also depends on the managers that you have that might come in and actually, you know, they'll say, hi, I'm looking for somebody, and they use somebody, and then they go, oh, I can reuse this person, and they're very confident. So, you know.
Some of them will always stay and some of them will go away, but one of the problems I think we've had with a couple of Oricons is that we didn't make our meetings sufficiently welcoming. And I think that's a good tool when we get someone in there.
Absolutely.
And the people who are already working on that.
Yeah, just wanted to speak to the point that people who volunteer to be part of a convention, very often you'll, like, for example, Con Zealand, we've got a form that they fill out for volunteers. Now, some of these people we don't know. And we won't know because they're from all over
That's
the
right.
place and they've volunteered to be part of New Zealand. The thing is, a lot of them don't understand what a WorldCon is. I know, I didn't really understand what WorldCon was, way back when, because I'd say, they'd say, oh, Mary, what have you done? Oh, I've run 3 conventions. Well, WorldCon's nothing like that. Well, and it basically, I used to get, every time I'd ask a question, it'd be like, well, you know how when you run a convention, yeah, WorldCon's not like that. I'm like, well, what is it like? And nobody could tell me. And this kind of segues into what I was saying before about having something written down, an explanation to tell people what it's like, how it works, how the hierarchy works. Because you were saying about people expecting to come in at high level jobs, and people don't understand why not. They've run conventions, why aren't they coming in at a high level job? Because in WorldCon it's a different structure. And one good example is there's this guy who volunteered for New Zealand, had a background in the Burning Man festivals,
Right, yeah.
Kiwi Burn. Okay, he'd done like equivalent of dockmaster for them, move in, move out, that sort of thing. Brilliant. I thought, great. He'd be terrific at move in, move out. So, he contacted me. I would talk to him and I said, well, there's this, you can do that. And we're back and forth for a bit. And then he went, yeah, no, I don't think that's going to work with me. I really wanted to be George's liaison.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, that's not going to happen ever. Like, but I mean, this is why he wanted to be part of it. And it was
the
real
question
bugger
is,
because he's really good.
how do you manage some of those expectations? And we're always going to get people who volunteer to work on conventions who have unreasonable expectations. But I think they have unreasonable expectations about much of the rest of their lives too, in some cases.
Yeah, very likely. But the thing is, he'd put down all the stuff that made him an excellent option
for
to be
one
move in, move
particular
out.
job. Absolutely.
And the annoying thing is, he could possibly have met George, and if he had just been that job.
And sometimes you can explain that to people, and sometimes you absolutely cannot. And if it's an annual convention, you've got a better chance of saying, the first year you kind of got to pay your dues. But with a WorldCon, it's really hard. I don't know.
Yeah. And basically, maybe if there'd been something written down explaining that, there's this whole structure thing.
Well, the problem is each group has a different structure. And I think that's one of the things that we wanted to speak a little to is, how do you decide on the structure that you have? Because each group puts together a structure based on their needs, the kinds of things that they want to have happen at their convention, the people that they have and don't have, and some of their unique situational issues. So
but it's just a case of saying that something like a high level job, which let's face it, that would be, is kind of already done. That's not part of the
except it
equation.
isn't necessarily. So we have, I'm one of the people who had a brevet commission. It was 1989, well actually it was 1988, and I had a student who really, really wanted to go into science fiction publishing. And this WorldCon was going to be in Boston in 1989. And so I wrote to them and said, I have a student, she'd like to do PR type of work around as an intern. And so one of the 2 members of the staff, the chairman, came into my office. His name is Jim Hudson, on a rainy day. And he and I talked about what he would do with my student, Babette, and the kinds of jobs she would have and that sort of thing. And we were all done, and I figured he was going to leave. And then he looked at me and said, now what do we have to do to get you? And that was my introduction to con running. And by the end of the convention, I was the chairman's aide, and I was one of the top level decision makers on the day, solving problems and doing all of that sort of stuff. So sometimes we end up with people who, slide into those, but you're right, they don't get the job right away, and we have to see how they're going to act under fire. Is there a way to tell people that without seeming mean? Yeah, I know.
But you can watch people and you can spot talent. You can, I've been a crisis counselor off and on for 5-10 years. which is how I started working opposite conventions. And someone said, "You never seem to be upset." Well, my first practicum at it was working on a locked ward in a mental hospital. I think fans are just wonderful people. And they hardly ever remind me of that job.
I think a lot of this keeping the staff or keeping the volunteers after they've entered correlates a lot with what you were saying earlier, that the face-to-face contact is the best way to go when you're running conventions now. The technology helps when you're having difficulty filling spots in a convention. You could take them from out.
The technology is necessary in order to communicate on a regular basis.
But
all of your planning really requires that now.
Now it does. But I think in addition to running this convention, which is a big project, it's teamwork. And I think a lot of people become friends doing it. So I guess keeping them around, I guess one of those things where you have to realize it's kind of a stepping stone to get up into the higher levels. Usually not all the time, but there's some people you understand.
Well, I think we in this room mostly understand that. I think Kathy's question was very different.
But anyway, I think it's the camaraderie that comes with it. Some people feel that, and then some people don't. Some people get disenfranchised from some committees, and I guess maybe it could be dynamics or something of working
Could
with
be the
each
nature
other.
of the group. There's all sorts of reasons for that.
Yeah.
You know.
There are all
kinds of
sorts of
things.
different group styles, and some of it works better than others.
Yeah,
Some people gaffiate, some people faffiate. And there's a
Yeah.
difference between feeling like you're forced away from it and just making the decision on your own that you're going to leave.
Exactly.
So-
And it's just another social situation as I see it.
And what I think a lot of what helps is asking people what they want to do. If you've watched someone and that they've done a very good job for you, if I had been working every year with Jessica, the next thing I would have asked her is, what would you like to do next year? And
yeah.
I would have moved heaven and earth to see that she did it.
How do you prioritize, or do you prioritize drawing from community versus drawing from greater fandom for the jobs that you want to have them fill at the WorldCon?
Good question.
Well, you actually answered your own question. Use the word greater. Which one's greater?
Well, by greater I meant.
Yeah, I know what you meant, but the question is sometimes a matter of where you're going to get the best talent, right?
Well, there's also a size of scale too. Kathy and I are both from the Northwest, and we have much larger conventions. For Seattle or Portland to run a WorldCon, but Portland still doesn't have the hotels, still it's going to be too small. But we've got a better shot because we're used to conventions that are larger and have scaled up some. I didn't understand when I went to work for Kansas City, and this was me not doing my research. I didn't understand that their largest local convention was something on the order of 400 people. And to go from 1,500 people to 6,000 is one jump in numbers. To go from 400 to 6,000 is a much larger jump. So it takes looking down and going, okay, which jobs really need somebody that understands this is a full week with 6,000 people and how much they're going to have to do. Our first WesterCon in Portland nearly failed completely because we had no clue that working for 5 days was different than 2.5 days. The size wasn't that different, but people were crashing and burning into the wilderness. And ever since, I was one of the people that almost didn't crash and burn. I've been saying to people, you have to scale up on size. So for instance, a job like facilities, when you're dealing with so much tons more space than one hotel, I would at least want one local person who knew the local facilities, and one person who's dealt with that division before and knows how many emails you get from all of those 6,000 people wanting to get their rooms. And it's hard.
Especially when there's 2 or 3 of them that you want to take out and drown. Not that we know any of this.
Well, but the other thing is that nobody could have told my group when we were all in our early 20s or whatever. No one could have told our group that we couldn't survive for 5 days the same way we did 2.5. It's very hard to tell people that, I know my job. I've been doing my job for years. You can't tell me how to do my job. And it's very hard. And that balancing act to where you don't sound like you're coming in and taking over is really, really hard.
Yeah, I think just to answer Linda's question, if all things were equal between somebody local and somebody who was from outside the area, you would probably want the local doing it. All things being equal, they rarely are. So you have to decide what are the important characteristics that you're looking for in that person. What are their capabilities? What ability would someone who doesn't live locally have to be there when they need to be there? And does that balance the other characteristics enough to make it make?
Go for it.
So most of you probably don't know me. I'm Sunny Jim. I'm with NorwestCon.
No, but I love your jacket.
Thank
Okay,
you.
I had to say
Something that I have found very helpful as a division head level position in that convention and as vice chair there was we spent some time thinking really deeply and carefully about management. And it was a great way of helping train us as division head level people and then having us interacting with our staff to recruit and retain those people. What are some of the things that you think are really helpful from just management theory perspective on keeping people and keeping them happy and feeling valued?
Oh, those are all brilliant questions, and they'll take a lot longer than the hour or so we have left. But I, from the point of view of how do you make people feel appreciated, I have a couple of rules. One is praise in public, and any necessary beatdowns happen in private, so that you only engage in public praise of your staff. If there's a screw up, it's my fault. It's not the people who work for me, it's my fault. And I think that we have to take ownership of the convention and ownership of our of the problems, but you don't hang people out to dry. I think that buses are made to be ridden on, not throwing people under. We had one of the things that we now see at WorldCons a lot is people at various WorldCons, because we don't have, the sort of continuing effort. We want to thank people who've gone above and beyond. And so there are sorts of heroes of the convention medals that some conventions have done. And we wanted to make those really meaningful. So in 2004, we gave 11. That was it. Because if somebody just did their job and did it really well, that's what we all signed on for. But if somebody did their job and somebody else's job and somebody else's job, and they dove in and they made it absolutely extra special, then we gave them a hero medal, and we explained why, and then they got to wear it for the convention. And there are other groups that give more medals than that. And they say they want more recognition, and that's, so I think you make some of those choices too, is how is it that you're going to recognize people? I think the last thing that ever goes into your program book, the last thing that you format to put in your souvenir book should be your committee list, so that everybody's name, to the extent that it's possible, gets in that committee list so they can point to it and say, I was recognized. And I think this is one area, by the way, where none of us do this, and we should. We should have our newsletters. If you have a convention newsletter, they should be printing the lists of people who are working on your convention who didn't get into the committee list.
The other thing is you can do silly things. One is I worked on a WorldCon where they were giving out leftover ribbons from horse and cat shows. And of all of the things I've ever gotten that I still have at home, I still have my giant cat show best of breed which caused Martin Easterbrook to look at me and say, honey, I think you're only of breed. But the other thing, and this was back at Marie's Con 3, was I was seconding program, and it was one of the first years where program participants had to pay, but they'd get reimbursed if they were on there. And we had complete lunatics trying to get on the program. And because I was seconding the heads, I appeared to be one of the main people talking to lunatics, although we all got the only fan from Iceland and various other peculiar crazy people who would wander in. And Priscilla Olson, who was one of the division heads, at one point I was talking to someone that no one had ever heard of what he was a fan of, but he wasn't going to talk do anything until I let him be on program. She comes over in the middle of this horrible discussion in which I'm being very patient, and she puts a blue dot on my badge. And so we started awarding blue dots to everybody who was talking to a lunatic. And I was very proud that I ended up with the second most blue dots at the end of the convention. And it's dumb, but that is something I remember 30 years later when I can't remember, things that draw you together, people that notate that you're doing something special. It doesn't matter what they are, recognize people. And the more fun, the better.
Yeah, I mean, the public, a lot of people are affirmed by the public recognition, but some of the private things that are much more meaningful. Again, it depends on the person. You've got to know what works for them at a sort of crass level. What are the buttons to push? Works for a given person. What do you need to do to get them to be productive and useful in your convention?
And once they are, make sure that they know that you appreciate everything that they've done. Because I think, frankly, we certainly couldn't do this by ourselves. And I also think it's important for us to recognize that the people who are doing this are doing it for love. They're doing it for love of the event. They're doing it for love of the activity. They're doing it because they have good friends. They're doing it for lots and lots and lots of different reasons. So it's not like they're doing it for money or anti-money. I had somebody ask me, how much do they pay you to chair the World Cup? And I said, it was about minus 20,000. Why do you ask? So it's like, we know our friends don't do this for money any more than we do. And what would motivate us? Think about what it is that makes you feel good about what you've done.
Which isn't necessarily what will make somebody else feel good.
No, but the late Pete Weston, who was one of my guests about it at Norris Con 4, said that ego boo is that feeling that you get when you look at something you've done and you go, damn, that's good. And we want that feeling of ego boo to be something that everybody takes away with them. So that's mine.
Actually, a phrase that an old friend of mine came up with was, fun is doing stupid things with intelligent people.
And pyrotechnics?
That too. Occasionally.
Yeah. Well, face it, we're all crazy, but we're differently crazy.
Yeah.
But boy, are we all crazy.
So the hard piece, which is where somebody on your team is seriously underperforming. So you can't go to them and say, oh, you're doing a fabulous job, because they're actually doing a crap job. They're not only not doing the job you need them to do, they're bringing everybody else around you down. Now, how do you manage a person out of the role, possibly even out of the convention completely, if they're being sufficiently disruptive? And how do you do that without ending up having the reputation of being the bitch or the complete prick or the person that nobody wants to work for ever again?
Well, you don't do it often. You do it when you really need to, and you have to face the fact that you will be the bitch who's doing that.
Yep.
But most often people know they're underperforming, and they may have reasons. We all have reasons. I have a life.
You do? Cool.
She doesn't believe it, but I do. But what you can do is talk about whether something is being too much for somebody, whether they need help, whether they need to step back. And most of the time, you can solve it that way. I've had people that looked up and went, yeah, I really can't do this. But if worst comes to worst, sometimes you got to fire people. It's just very seldom do you need to do that.
I had to fire 3 people. All 3 of them knew it was coming.
Mm-hmm.
When somebody
Good
was,
point.
huh?
That's a very good
Yeah.
point. That it should
You
never
know,
become
and
as a surprise.
When I said to someone, you and I need to have a little chat. Can we step outside or something like that? It was actually what I usually tried to do is make it much less of a spur of the moment thing and much more of a, I'd like to have a talk with you. And we'd go out to dinner and they knew, so firing people because it's complete disassociation is one thing. Telling someone that they're completely underperforming, I think is harder.
Mm-hmm.
Because the question is, do you want them to stay in the role, right? Or are you going to have to remove them?
Do you
think, know what you want going into that?
Do you think, part of that is, do you think that with the appropriate guidance, the appropriate discussion, that they will be able to perform? Because as we said, it shouldn't come as a surprise if you're doing your job.
Yeah.
If you've been communicating with them, or if you've been trying to and you're not getting anything from them, those are indications, but it just shouldn't come as a surprise. And most people want to perform.
I actually came up, there was a general question, but I realized as we were talking it through, there was a person who I had to deal with in my role. It wasn't senior leadership, but I was running a team. And over a series of cons, and not just one con of not performing, but over a series of cons in a similar role with a person who believed he or she had a God-given right to be in a specific role and was going to do that regardless of any considerations I might have had as the team lead, and was going to be in that position to the exclusion of other people. And eventually it became obvious that I had to have a conversation. So it wasn't really underperforming, but it was a personal behavior that was totally disruptive to anything else I might have been trying to achieve. And I just wonder if my colleagues here are going, yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about. And that, well, no. As far as we can tell.
Well,
but is that a downside?
In this case, possibly not. I have to be very honest.
Yeah.
One of the real issues here is, depending on the size of your convention, do you have anyone to replace them with? I'm sorry, this comes down to it with volunteers, that at least once, and this was not on a WorldCon, this was on an Oricon, is that we limped through following up with something because we had absolutely nobody to replace that person with. But otherwise, you look at it and see what you can do. Can you do things to keep them? Is there a lesser job they can slide into so it doesn't look like they're being demoted, whatever?
Is this an issue of toxicity, or is it an issue of just underperforming the work, Yeah. Toxicity, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Personal view of what should be happening.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, if you have situations like that, frankly, that there are times when you're much better off without the person, even if their work contribution has been okay, or even exemplary. If they're doing more damage to your organization, I think that's the time when you pull the plug on it.
And sometimes you can find something else to do that's an or else. I had someone that I had to tell could only write a limited number of emails to a list and had to write in bullet points. And let me tell you, that was the only conversations I'd had that were more unpleasant with that were as a hospital social worker dealing with parents of abused children, which I had to do at one point. But I honestly mean, you have to put this in bullet points because you're really bothering 6 other people. At that point, I am fairly certain that the word bitch was used in my direction as they left the conversation, and that's what happened.
I pride myself on that. We can't hear you. Ben?
To a certain extent, at times you can use structure as a way to deal with it. You can devise a structure where the person is less toxic. In one really peculiar case that I was working on, it was a WorldCon. I was a non-local division head. This person had a large following among the local community in the city and was therefore essentially politically unfireable. I just could not fire the person. The person failed repeatedly, was toxic, and I did the only thing I could think of doing. I promoted the person because I found a job with a much higher title, boy, does this look like a promotion. Well, it was a promotion into a position where the person could do no harm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that is exactly one of the things to do.
Fail up.
You know, if you can switch someone's role to, and although I recognize that, you know, Ben's suggestion is certainly a valid one, sometimes even just making a lateral move that really has them with real responsibility, but where they have much less contact with other people,
yes,
that's sometimes where you want to go, right?
Where is your line on you don't think you can, you've tried prompting them to change and they don't do it? What is the point where you're like, okay, now I'm done with them?
Okay, so what part of it depends on where you are in the cycle of the convention.
Okay, so you're half year out from an annual convention.
It still depends. Part of it depends on how large a following or who they're dealing with. Some of it depends on if you can put someone in to work with them who will really do the work, depending on, you know, there are lots of aspects to that. I had one person on one convention that I decided was kind of nuts. And I have a degree that says I can at least have an opinion on that. And I decided it was too late in the cycle to fire them, but I could turn around to the next chair and say, it's not too late for you.
Yeah.
But you've got all of these things, you know, how much damage are they doing to your committee? I mean, there are dozens of factors with it. Are they married to somebody else on your committee?
Oh, that's a hard one.
And that's one of the reasons why a lot of this stuff has never been written down, because there's so many different combinations of conditions, the different things you have to take into account when you're in that situation, that you could spend your entire life trying to figure out all the combinations. And you just have to make the decision based on what you know at the time.
But having had to get rid of people at some point, what are for you like the warning signs of, yeah, this is when I should have gotten rid of this person?
Oh,
then, or
you know, I think it. So the answer to that is also it depends. There are times when you go, oh, I should have known, I should have recognized that X was a problem, but you didn't because you were distracted. The thing went by too fast. For whatever reason, it didn't stick out for you. I think the one time I got rid of somebody pretty fast, and that was because I found out that that particular person was bad-mouthing their boss at a convention to pros. I was like, nope, you're out. That's it.
Yeah.
You get one shot at that, and that was it. In another case, you know, so as soon as I found out about it, it was gone. In another case, I had somebody who should have been a great self-starter. He was very high in state government in another state to our north. He was just incredibly competent. And so I told him what I wanted, and then I didn't do the kind of follow-up I should have done. And I should have had deliverables, and I didn't have deliverables. So I didn't ask him early enough, and then he disappeared. So am I a failure at some of that? Absolutely.
Some of it is that people don't trust their own management gut reaction. We are trying to be nice human beings. The first time I chaired a convention, I wanted to be a nicer human being than I want to be now. She keeps laughing at me. I don't know why.
Because you're funny.
But the truth of it is that there was one time where I really looked up and go, oh, honestly, this person should probably go. But it was on an Oricon where these people were friends.
Well, for most people, for most people, those kinds of decisions and the interaction that results from it are hard, and people try to avoid things that are that hard and can be that painful. At some point, you have to just.
Yeah, Esther says, can I add, there are lots of warning signals, but it's always too late because you will often give the benefit of the doubt because we are all good people. That's a hard decision.
Absolutely, it is.
It totally is. And you want to be nice, especially if it's in your own town, because you are going to run into that person at a pub later. And if that's the person you fired, that's incredibly uncomfortable. If it's somebody's husband, then you risk losing both of them. And all of it just gets very complicated.
And just as a sort of general note, one of the things that makes it all hard, you're also the one that hired him.
Yes.
So at some level, you're admitting to yourself that you screwed up. Right? Because, you know, every one of my personnel problems was my fault.
And
at that level.
Yeah, that gets back to the accountability. The buck stops at the top in most organizations, and somebody has to be ready to, and if you're going to be in that position, you've got to accept that.
On a convention, the one person that I did have to really let go, I knew when I put that person in the position that probably that wasn't my best idea, but I was being nice. And afterwards went, let's go kick ourselves in a corner, because by trying to be nice, I had to be 10 times as mean later on.
Yeah, you've got to think of the convention first. This happened to a friend of mine who ran a national convention. He hired as you a person who was exceedingly efficient, had lots of contacts with the writers groups around the country, and he found out a few months before the convention that she'd been promising the writers accommodation and registration, and they only found out because one of the writers contacted the treasurer and said, okay, where do you want my bank details? I'm like, sorry, what? Bank details for what? So you can reimburse me. Pardon?
Oh my God.
And and then he found out that she'd been promising all this, and he had to fire her just straight out. There wasn't any.
Yeah, no, there's
question.
no
I mean,
option.
she knew, you know, she wasn't someone who thought that this was the way things were done.
Yeah.
It was someone, she thought this was the way things should be done, and she was going to do it, you know.
Was she going to pay for it too?
Yeah, exactly.
Apparently not.
But yeah, he copped a lot of flack from their very vocal friends for that.
Yeah.
Fortunately, a lot of the writers, when their situation was explained to them, sort of went, oh yeah, we thought that was a bit funny.
Yeah. God, that's
Yeah,
awful.
yeah, there's certain things that, that they're firing offenses. But if you think but if it hasn't reached that level yet, are you willing to put the effort? Is it worth putting the effort in to try to remediate it?
And some of it is, do you have a replacement for them? Very practical.
A little bit of twofold. We had a problem with for-profit conventions now having to pay volunteers some sort of stipend. But I want to talk about how the real world legalities are coming into our conventions, such as during 2009, when everything was tanking and there was a lot of people unemployed, it got to where you could put your volunteer work on your resume. But the thing was, the person who, they put in their volunteer work, the people that when they were checked, when those items were checked, they talked to people who weren't aware. Like in California, the best thing you can say is they worked from this time to this time, and that's it. You make no other comments.
Yeah.
But for, in fandom, there are no borders, and there are people who were getting really, if somebody was pissed off at one of the volunteers, I mean, this was hurting people trying to get jobs to feed their families. We got to be careful of, our walls, our borders, of how what we do in a convention will affect a person's actual resume.
Well,
in the future.
The issue there is, are they putting volunteer activities on their resume and making it clear that this is volunteer work?
Right.
And then further, are they asking the people that they've worked for to give them recommendations? Quite frankly, if somebody's asking me that and they've been a volunteer, then I'm going to be quite limited in how I'm going to answer that. But I also understand some of the things that are going to cause problems. And, if you're going to put something on there and say, I did this volunteer work, and it should be thought of as one of the things that's making the decision about whether or not I get paid for this job, then you have to take some responsibility for that too. And, yeah, it might hurt your family. Put that thing on there.
Yeah, well, I do volunteer work for the Game Developers Conference every year, and that you definitely, I put it on my resume because that's the industry that I work in. But I've always had good reports because I've talked to the people beforehand and that sort of thing. Thank you.
Thank you. We got a signal about 4 minutes ago saying we had 5 minutes, so I think we're done. Are we done?
I think so.
Thank you. I think we're done.
Thank you for all the questions and comments.
So my understanding is tonight that there's going to be an activity as sort of the icebreaker where you can go around and ask people for help with various things in terms of the tables. And so you might, some of you have specific questions, get answers from very different kinds of people if you did that later.
And the more different answers you get, the better off you'll be.
Or the more confused.
Well, either one, yes.
Sometimes it's the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, we have the interesting thing, when somebody is looking for a position, people will, there are things when somebody asks you, do you know this person, you think of them that you won't put in an email. Say, call me.
Oh, God, yes.
And
I would never put some of that stuff in an email. I'm on the phone saying,
Exactly.
oh, you don't,
Call me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
I don't want any